Greetings, my name is Shimei from MAGaming.com, and I wanted to talk a little bit about Gottacon, the army composition I had going into it, and what the actual con was like competitively. So, going into it, one of the things I think summarized Gottacon very well that one of the other guys said to me was that everybody had very competitive lists. They were all very rock hard lists, but the competitors themselves did not come across as being ultra competitive. Everybody was actually very good sportsmen. All of my opponents were quite nice. I think there was only one guy that was a little bit distraught by how his army was doing, but other than that, everybody seemed to be having a good time and having a lot of fun, but still having really competitive games. So the actual scene was full of stuff that would really make you rage if the people themselves were assholes about their lists, but they weren't, and so it was just good old competitive Warhammer. For my list itself, what I generally, I'm actually very happy with my list because, well, I don't find it too flexible in a battle plan. I do find that it poses a question to my opponent as to whether or not they know how to deal with it, and the answer for most of them so far has not been very good. I took a very similar army to Attack X. Did a little bit better at Attack X than I did at Gottacon. I went 4-1 at Attack X, and in Gottacon I finished 3-1-1, so that's 3 wins, 1 draw, 1 loss. So overall, this army, relatively unchanged, is 7-2-1. So I'm pretty happy with that record if I could continue onwards with it. I wouldn't mind improving it, of course, but as it is, it's doing fairly well for me, especially like the circumstances of my draws and losses. I haven't been upset with the army's performance at all. It's just sort of a random chance thing that does happen. And so let's talk a little bit about what my Empire army is and what I have for my composition. I have a lot more than 25% of core, mainly because I have this giant block of 57 spearmen. It's got 3 characters in it. So it's got 57 spearmen with full command, and they have 2 detachments. 1 unit of 20 militia, and 1 unit of 20 handgunners. So when I deploy, which this is pretty much my standard deployment, as you can see here, sometimes it'll get flipped over, but the line doesn't change too much, mostly because I don't have much more room than this in the deployment zone. If there's any kind of terrain or anything like that in a deployment zone, I will fill up this board. So this is, if you were to go against me, this is the line that you would most likely see in some variant. The parent unit, they all get deployed at once. I also don't have much in the way of drops, so most of the time I'm finished deploying before my enemy. It doesn't matter too much to me, because my battle line and battle plan doesn't change too much based on what where my opponent goes. So I just sort of drop my stuff and then let my opponent do what he wishes. That does mean that my opponent can out-deploy me if his army is capable of doing so, but I'm pretty happy with the line as it is. And then I also have 20 crossbowmen as more core. So the majority of my army is core, and I like spearmen. Most people take halberdiers. My spearmen are all equipped with shields, and riding them in a big block of horde, they get a lot of attacks. And when augmented by warrior priests or the lore of shadow, which is what I take for my level 4 wizard, they can generally get things done. It was mainly, the block was mainly made to get as many possible attacks as it could on the charge, with hatred and rerolls and things along of that nature. They're still humans, so they can't really fight themselves out of a wet paper bag if they're unsupported, but it's nice to have that overwhelming amount of attacks and to have the absorption so that I can get hit by something very big and still have a usable unit. I'm really happy with the detachments. I love the detachment system of the Empire. For those of you that don't know, a detachment gets deployed with its parent unit, which in this case is this big block of spearmen. It can't be more than half the size of the unit, which for a unit of 60, if it was a full unit of 60, would be 30. My detachments are 20. They get almost all of the special rules that a parent unit is affected by, as long as they're within 3 inches of the parent unit. This includes stuff like Stubborn and Steadfast, as well as Hatred and Frenzy. Anything that they're given of that nature will affect the parent unit, or will affect the detachments. Warrior Priest buffs, when cast on a parent unit, will also pass to the detachments as well. So the system is really good, and the main reason why I've taken Spearman instead of like a greatsword block with detachments is because when detachments get taken for a unit, they get put into the same slot as the parent unit comes from. So greatswords are special. So if I took a large greatsword unit with detachments, which would be preferable, they all get put into special, and I would have almost no core. So that's why I had to go with the spearmen. I would prefer the greatswords because it's just straight up better, but not actually possible. So that's my core. For special, I have 1 cannon. Most Empire will have at least 2. I do have 2, and you include the steam tank. But the actual cannons themselves, I find far too fragile to take too many of, especially in this current edition. They're huge targets, and they're the easiest cannons to take off the table. Everybody else's cannons are more defensible, so I take the 1 because cannons are still amazing, but I don't go too overboard with it. I also have my demigryphs over there, 3 of them, which demigryphs are great value. They're some of the best value monstrous cavalry in the game, mainly because they're one of the cheapest, and yet they're still toughness 4 with a 1+ armor save. And the mount themselves, the actual demigryph, is one of the better mounts. The only reason they're cheaper is because they're ridden by the worst riders. They're just the weapon skill 4, they're inner circle knights on demigryphs. Great for the 1+ armor save though. You pit them up against anything that has strength 3 or 4 attacks, and they'll be there all day. Even strength 5, so long as you don't roll too badly, they'll be there for a long time. For my rare section, I've got 2 Hellblasters, and my Hellblasters are really my main workhorses for my army. I use them as my primary source of damage, and it's devastating to the damage output of the army when they get destroyed. So I've got both of them, and they are supported by engineers. Both Hellblasters always have an engineer beside them, because the engineer allows you to re-roll one of their 3 artillery dice that they roll to see how many shots they get, and use his ballistic skill. So it increases their ballistic skill from 3 to 4. So at their maximum range, you'll still be hitting on 4s. Pretty awesome, especially with the amount of shots you can send down range. And they are strength 5 armor piercing, so they can go against anything, even 1-up armor saves, and consistently wound. And then I've got my steam tank. Some people take 2. I don't think I'd be able to fit that and the 2 Hellblasters, and I prefer the 2 Hellblasters. Also, I don't think it's really necessary. The 1 steam tank has proved invaluable. For my characters, I've got my level 4 Shadow Wizard, and he's got a Dispel Scroll. That's really like, if I could get away with not having a level 4 with the Dispel Scroll, I would, because I'm not a fan of the Magic Phase at all for this edition, but you need something defensively, so that's what he is. I've got a Witch Hunter in my main unit here, because they are very cost-efficient magic resist. Even if that's all that you're taking them for, it's 35 points usually for magic resist 2, which is what he has, and he is like base 20 more points than that. So for 20 more points you get all of his other special rules that make the unit immune to terror, They have the magic resist. He has, you can give him a brace of pistols, and he declares an enemy a heretic in your opposing army that you can shoot at with the sniper special rule and get killing blow. And he's got his fancy things, but for how cheap he is, he's, I'd say, an absolute must for anybody that's actually running an infantry block of any kind. Just, he's cheap. He's your cheapest hero and one of your most efficient. So I would always suggest taking a witch hunter. And then I've got my BSB here, who is pretty much naked. For magical items, I don't really have much in the way of magical items in my army. I much prefer to take more troops than to take more magic items, specifically with Empire, because my heroes are rather weak, and so augmenting them with magical items is not generally worth it. So my BSB has full plate armor and an enchanted shield, so he's at 2+ armor save. My Witch Hunter has a brace of pistols and the Iron Curse icon, so the whole unit will get a 6+ ward against war machines. And then I've got my actual general over here, which is Archlector on a War Altar. He's got the most in the way of magical items, almost his full complement. He's got the Armor Meteoric Iron, which gives him a 1+ armor save and a 6+ ward. He's got the Van Horseman Speculum, so he can swap stats, strength, toughness, attacks, and initiative in a challenge. And he has the Dragonbane Gem and a great weapon. So he's 5 points under the 100 that he could be for magical items, but I'm happy with the gear that he has. And the War Altar itself was a late addition to my army, but I was planning on taking either 2 cannons or the War Altar, and I gotta say, really happy with the War Altar. It being a large target means that with the general on top of it, you have an 18-inch bubble for your leadership radius, and being on top of it didn't actually kill my general more than like once in the tournament, and that was because he fled, not because he actually took damage. And it does make him a nice big target. I've had people pointing hell cannons and everything else at him rather than my units, so I'd rather him take a single strength 5 hit because they failed to get him under the hole and have the chariot roll a ward than have a strength 5 template hit any of my units. So that's my actual composition. I've got the 2 engineers as well, and they're naked, like for the purposes of getting myself up to 24.99. I gave them light armor, which is like 1 point each for the both of them, but that's really just for rounding out points. It has no real purpose. Now, for my actual strategy, I almost always go with this kind of deployment or a reverse deployment. The Steam Tank and the Demigryphs will almost always be on opposite flanks, and the Steam Tank will almost always be on the flank that has the single Hellblaster. Because of its random movement, it's got a 360-degree charge arc, and it's unbreakable, so I don't ever have to worry about it going anywhere, and it's a amazing flank protection. As long as it's alive, that one flank, I don't have to worry about at least one of the units that it's going to be around, if not more. If it's a small unit of skirmishers or something like that trying to get my war machines, and they manage to get charged by the Steam Tank, they'll probably get wiped out, and then I can prevent the next unit trying to get to my Hellblaster, especially if it's firing at the same time while trying to defend itself. Almost everything I have in my army, well, everything I have that shoots, is move or shoot. So I don't have the ability to change my arcs, so most of the time I will not deploy on the baseline of 12, depending against who I'm going against. I will most likely deploy a little bit farther back so I can angle my crossbowmen and my handgunners towards the center without having to move them later on in the game. And that does mean that my outside flanks don't have as good a coverage from my strength 4 shooting, but they will have the cannons. One of the things that the War Altar does that some people don't know is that it gives hatred in a 6-inch radius to every unit within a 6-inch radius, and it also gives the warrior priest buffs. Like if the warrior priest on top of it casts a buff, it'll also give it to all units within a 6-inch radius. The way that parent units work is they pass down all of their stuff. So if I cast a warrior priest buff from this unit and it's within 6 inches of the parent unit, then with this kind of placement, that 6-inch buff, so long as these crossbowmen are within 6 inches, will hit everything here except for this Hellblaster, this Engineer, these Demigryphs, and this Steam Tank. They also will all have hatred so long as I'm within 6 inches here. So I'm really happy with the War Altar, and I like the placement of where I have him. It has had a major effect in some of my games, and I'm just really familiar with this list. The War Altar himself, rather than taking the additional cannon, it's tougher in that it's got 5 wounds, it's toughness 5, it's got a 4+ ward, plus the character on top of it, it's stubborn, it's got a bounce spell in and of itself, which is banishment, and I love that bounce spell. I cast it more often than I don't every magic phase, especially because the lures that I take are generally to help augment what I do. So long as I have the toughness debuffer, if I roll up the toughness debuffer for Shadow, I try to get at least the toughness debuffer and the signature, and that's generally the only thing that I'll cast until my opponent gets into melee. And then if I'm lucky enough to have Occams, I'll cast it on this unit and try to get as many of those strength 7 or 8 attacks I can. And that's my basic strategy, really, is just shoot at them as they come to me. I can't really move too much at all. The Demigryphs and the Steam Tank will help protect my flanks, while the War Altar and the Steam Tank will try to take care of skirmishers with the banishment and the random movement. The knights themselves don't deal well with skirmishers, but in the games that I've had, them having them be on the flank and keeping them there. I don't advance with them. I stay put with them. They really help against flyers. Just so long as I've got the charge arcs correct with my Demigryphs, flyers can't move 20 inches towards them without still being in the charge arc. So just having them parked on that left flank is usually enough to keep flyers away from my back lines, and then the rest of the shooting, which is focused on flyers and high movement stuff first, is enough to deter it from coming up front. So the primary weaknesses of my army are the fact that my war machines are quite weak. They're just war machines. They're toughness 7 at range with 3 wounds and no armor at all. There's no light armor around. So they will die to poison attacks very quickly, or even just regular bow fire if you're somewhat accurate or have enough of it. And that really does hurt my army's ability to damage people as they come towards me, especially because I refuse to go towards my enemy. I'm not a marching army, not at all. And so I depend on damage being dealt to my enemy as they come to me. If my enemy refuses to come to me, then I have very little in the way of options except to shuffle forward just far enough that they can't get out of my range and pummel them as much as I can. But range itself, especially if you're going up against an unbreakable army or anything with decent leadership, pure range itself will very rarely get you enough points to win a game. So my worst opponents are people like dwarves that play the exact same kind of army. They play a "you're going to come to me" army. And especially if I'm going up against a dwarf army that's put more points into range than I have, because a dwarf army can get more shooting while still having reliable close combat without having to take dedicated close combat units. If I went up against an all dwarf army, let's say, that took all crossbowmen with great weapons, those crossbowmen with great weapons will beat out my spearmen and you won't even have to take any of them, especially if he makes them stubborn or something like that. And so at range, he'll have the same range as my crossbowman and the same ballistic skill, but refuse to come to me. So it's not a perfect army. There are other armies that will absolutely trump mine, specifically a stand and shoot dwarf army, or even wood elves. Wood elves would probably be a bad thing for me just because they all have a range of 30, whereas my handgunners are only 24, my hellblasters are only 24. I only have the one unit of 30 in my army, and that's one of the reasons why I take 20 crossbowmen and 20 handgunners. Is it's nice to have the -2 armor penetration with the handgunners, especially as the detachments, so they can stand and shoot and things like that. But with the 24-inch range, like, I much prefer crossbowmen for that 30, especially with the half being 15. You'll actually get some people to be within half with the crossbow. You'll almost never get half-range shots with the handguns. But I am very happy with how it did at Gottacon. Over the next few days, I'm going to be talking through the games that I have played, I've played at Gottacon, one at a time. I didn't manage to get nearly anything in the way of gameplay recorded because of the way the schedule worked at Gottacon. It was very limited for time. You had a set amount of time to play your games, and then the breaks would last like 10 to 15 minutes and you'd go to the next game. You didn't even really have time to wander around the con or get a drink or anything like that in between the breaks. So it was very hectic, very fast-paced sort of thing. I enjoyed it quite a bit, but it didn't lend itself well to me taking pictures. So it'll just have to be me describing the battle as it goes. I'll see what I can get for making maps and indicators of it. And it'll also be straight from memory because I didn't mark any of it down while it was happening. But I have a fairly good memory, so we'll see how that goes. And that'll be coming up in the next few days. You'll see just how well this army performed and against what it matched up against. So I'd like to thank you for watching, and I will be back again later.